Thank you so much for checking out this video. Are you a new or inexperienced dungeon master? Is everything overwhelming and you aren't sure how to create a great world filled with compelling NPCs for your players to journey through? If that's the case, then you'll find this video incredibly helpful, so keep listening. What can we learn from fantasy literature to educate dungeon masters as they build worlds, create non-player characters, and guide players? This is the question I hope to answer for you today with the help of a few great people who have aided my path in seeking the answer. I found several excellent sources that'll help explain the bedrock that supports the answer to this question. The foundation laid out in the question is multifaceted. For some, world building is the best part of being a dungeon master, and for others, it's more of a chore than a math homework. It can also be so much more than a chore to design a city, a shop, or even a whole world that the city is just a small part of. Infinite variety with world building is much the same for non-player characters or NPCs. They can be simple throwaway people, never to be seen again, or multi-faced characters to help deepen the plot. It all works from start to finish, but it doesn't have to be tedious and difficult. That's why I'm here, to help make it fun and easy, or at least that's the goal. The art of world building. The most challenging or daunting task for most dungeon masters is world building. How do I make a cool world? How do I design a city? What kind of lore should I write? What happens in this part of the world? Those are just some of the questions that went through my head, as well as the minds of several other dungeon masters I have had the chance to speak with. It's quite difficult to start, but reading can make it easier. In an article written by Masterclass, it is said that reading many different books or other kinds of media can give inspiration. This is so true, especially if you're reading the same genre, such as fantasy. My friend John, who is also an experienced dungeon master, let me interview him. I spent time asking some questions for a more like-minded take on the topic. When asked the question, what specifically have you learned from fantasy that have helped with world building, his answer was right in line with the question at hand. The most interesting fantasy books to me are the ones that present something new, often reflected in the cultures presented. I've learned a lot about creating new unique cultures and how they might differ from those of neighboring people, nations, and kingdoms. They can be influenced by anything from biology and botany to magical forces and deities. For him, myself, and many others, fantasy and world building go hand in hand. I have read a sizable amount of fantasy books, and all have made an impact on my inspiration, but none quite as much as my two favorite series. Dungeon Crawler Carl, written by Matt Dinneman, and He Who Fights with Monsters by Travis Deverell, aka Shirtaloon, have given me the most inspiration out of anything that I have read. For me, these books are prime examples for each part of the overall question. For world building, they are excellent examples of every form it can take, and both do it in such different ways. Dungeon Crawler Carl is a story of a man named Carl and his cat, Princess Donut, and their fight for survival in a world dungeon. Aliens created the dungeon by instantly scrapping every structure, vehicle, object, and 90% of all humans and living things. Each floor of this 18-level dungeon is a different story, save for the floors 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, and 18. Those are known as the Scolopendra levels and have a continuous story in them. Just from this rough synopsis, you can tell there's a lot of lore and world building taking place in this book. I don't want to spoil too much of the series, but there are so many plot threads, both silly and serious, locations and cities, as well as fantastic chunks of lore to inspire any world you could want to make. There are several instances of things that I have taken from Dungeon Crawler Carl, or at least adapted to my world. In the series, there are goblinoids, or goblins, hobgoblins, and bugbears, which are also monsters in Dungeon Crawler Carl and Dungeons & Dragons. They have varying degrees of proficiency in the crafting and usage of explosives. Down at the bottom, making the most rudimentary of explosives, are goblins. Above them are hobgoblins. Hobgoblins not only make more powerful explosives, but technically superior ones as well. They have things like superior smoke bombs, impact grenades, or C4-like material called hobgoblin pus. Bugbears have an even stronger form of the pus called bugbear paste, which is incredibly powerful. These tiers of explosives and their creators are something I have started to implement in my Dungeons & Dragons world. Another thing I've been working on implementing, amongst others, is several of the plot lines for quests or implementing entire books. The plot for Book 4 of this series Dungeon Crawler Carl and the Gate of the Feral Gods is so fun and unique, and it lends itself well to an interesting dungeon or short adventure. Essentially, the characters are trapped in these bubbles, which are small contained stories with plots that intertwine within themselves. Plots that grab you from the series, or others, are great ways to introduce something new and fun into your world for a one-off or an adventure for the party. You can even change it to make it fit your world if it doesn't quite fit perfectly. He Who Fights with Monsters is a story of a man named Jason Asano and his journey as he continuously gets into situations much bigger than himself on his way to try and fix not just one universe, but two. I like this book series for world-building inspiration. The way it introduces you to the world with big chunks of craziness, one at a time, keeps me hooked and inspired by the grandiose and unique things that make up the lore in the series. He Who Fights with Monsters has so many things that have inspired me that many others, including myself, wouldn't even consider when making a world. A unique power system, or power scaling, if you're unfamiliar with these terms, they mean a unique way to track progression, as well as the source of powers in that universe. These aren't something typically considered when making a world in Dungeons & Dragons because it already has its own, but making changes to its flavor or its functionality can make your world feel really unique and exciting. The series is a great one to adapt to your world, and you can change the power scaling or system to fit your world as you need. Characters start at Iron Rank and work their way towards Diamond Rank, with stops at Bronze, Silver, and Gold along the way. You can expand on this idea, adding more names and details for different ranks or whatever else you may want. The series even goes well beyond this main idea it's set up. These books are fascinating, with a vast pantheon of gods and other celestial beings that have inspired how I have set up the power levels in my world. Gods in this world are not just names and forces of nature that exist and barely interact with the world they help shape. They are beings of power for the people. In just about any town or city are places known as worship squares, where gods often make appearances to talk with worshippers or leaders in the congregations for that location's church. Gods will also use parts of their vast power to create miracles, which affect important events or important people. They can sometimes even gift gifts to people. Above gods are creatures called astral beings. They are these primordial forces, as important to the structure of the multiverse as the laws of physics. The mechanics of these celestial beings, both on a world scale and multiverse scale, are something I have adapted to my Dungeons & Dragons world. Keep in mind that anything can be adapted or inspire you. Something as small as the quirk of a species or as large as an entire pantheon all have a place and give you ideas. World building is whatever you want it to be or need it to be. Complex or simple, silly or serious. There is a multiverse of infinite possibilities out there, and it's up to you on how to fit it into your world. The craft of characterization, breathing life into NPCs. As a dungeon master myself, I know how challenging it can be to make non-player characters. Sometimes you have to create a character on the spot, somehow make it feel interesting, even if he or she is just a bartender or the owner of a local magic shop. NPCs are such a problem area for me, but through reading more and more fantasy, I've gotten a much better idea at understanding what makes a good or fun NPC. Before I delve into the long-winded explanations of how exposure to different sources can help, I'll have John start off his thoughts. NPCs can be very hit or miss. I love finding side characters from books I read and delving into them and why I like them. Is it their sense of humor? Maybe an accent or physical quirk? Once you find out what it is you like, it's easier to make more likable characters that players enjoy interacting with. One key is giving them a motive or desire outside of the protagonist. Give a character desires and flaws, and your players will relate to them on a much deeper level. John makes some excellent points that I'll expand on with that previously mentioned explanation. Non-player characters come in all shapes and sizes. Some are vitally important to the plot, while some are just fodder in a tavern brawl. Whichever they may be, I like adding depth to the characters my players will encounter, especially with characters who repeatedly appear in the campaign. Dungeon Crawler Carl has so many side characters and NPCs that any chapter of the books can give endless amounts of ideas. Like John previously mentioned, finding what you like about a certain character can help you make more characters similar in depth to the ones that you read about. There's a character named Mordecai in Dungeon Crawler Carl who's a personal favorite of mine. He's a simple example of taking something you really like about a character and replicating it across many others. I took the way that he speaks in the books, his accent, his mannerisms, and his general attitude, and put it into several dwarf characters in my world. Doing things like this can aid in improving those spur-of-the-moment NPCs, giving them a bit more life than they would normally have. Similarly, it can be fun to completely transplant characters from fantasy books that you've read or listened to. They don't have to be reoccurring if you don't want them to be. There are several characters I plan on introducing soon that are just copied and pasted over. Many of them are such unique and bombastic individuals that moving them across for just a little bit of time can really make strange and memorable encounters for the players. Crafting NPCs from scratch is much more complicated than what I've been talking about. That's where He Who Fights with Monsters comes in to help. In my opinion, these books have some of the best multi-layered characters I have come across. Here's something to keep in mind when reading. Always think to yourself what makes a character interesting, as John said earlier. What's their drive? What are their motivations? And most importantly, what are their flaws? The more I dungeon master and the more I read, the more I start to understand that flaws are truly some of the most important things a character can have to make them interesting. The author of He Who Fights with Monsters, Shirtaloon, does good work of writing flaws into the characters, both their backgrounds and the characters that are the main story. I have been inspired by this series, which helped me to create interesting characters. The protagonist of the series, Jason Asano, is deeply flawed and has to overcome them, and they're a part of him and stick with him. The title of the series is a reference to a quote from the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. He who fights with monsters might take care lest he thereby become a monster. It's very interesting to see Jason's throw away any morals that he had and ideals that he held, and match the pressure of the world and rise above the problems in front of him. For many of the books, he struggles deeply with the realization that he's changing and doesn't recognize what he's become. Filling your NPCs with flaws, even minor flaws, can make characters feel fleshed out and real. The flaws don't have to be as severe and debilitating as Jason's to work. Take, for example, a shop owner who's a kleptomaniac and sells what he steals, or a supposedly friendly bar owner who owes money to a local loan shark and takes a small break in his payments in exchange for screwing over the party. It can be such small things that make them more than just a face the group of players interact with once. If you're worried about your hard work of finally crafting these NPCs and their complexity that you cooked into them might be lost, don't worry. Francine Prose is an American author who wrote several books, including Reading Like a Writer, a guide for people who love books and those who want to write them, where she discusses several parts of being a writer and how reading and learning how to read to improve yourself are vastly important skills. There's a chapter in this book called simply Character that goes into detail about a book written by Heinrich von Kleist, titled The Marquis of O. The main focus is on von Kleist's writing style and how he can say so much about a character without expressly saying all that much. There's something that you should attempt to employ when introducing people and giving their description. Prose uses a small excerpt from Kleist. In M, a large town in northern Italy, the widowed Marquis of O, a lady of unblemished reputation and the mother of several well-bred children, published the following notice in the newspaper, that, without her knowing how she was in the family way, that she would like the father of the child she was going to bear to report himself, and that her mind was made up, out of consideration for her people, to marry him. From just these few sentences, you can learn a lot about the protagonist, her main issue, her outlook, as well as her views and ideals. Giving short information-packed introductions, like the one from the Marquis, for certain NPCs can make them feel much more real than characters like Jeremy the Half-Orc Bartender, or even fan favorites, Boblin the Goblin. Learning to make these inferences, like John and Prose, alike can make your life feel easier and your sessions more enjoyable. Non-player characters, as well as snowflakes in a storm, are as varied as snowflakes in a storm, or as boring as a brick in the wall. Make your characters layered like Jason Asano, or common and fun like Boblin the Goblin. It all comes down to the interactions you want with your players to have and the importance of that character that they're coming across. So keep in mind how you want your players to go through the world. Guiding players through the realm. Lessons from fantasy literature. We are in the last part of the question. And it's a bit more complicated than just learning and copying fun things into your worlds that you've read in a book. Now, we're going to move on to guiding your players, which brings in the first two parts of the question. How do you help your players go through the world that you've built and interact with the NPCs that you've created? Referencing John, once again, I asked him how reading fantasy has helped him guide and instruct players to have a more fruitful, rewarding experience in a campaign. John replied, I always find the similarities between their characters and characters I've read about. This gives examples of which directions their character arcs could take. As a DM, I enjoy preserving ethical dilemmas to the players, and knowing the choices of similar characters in the past helps me make them more impactful for the players. I think he's right on the money with this take. Let me show you why and how you can do similar things for your characters as well. Previously, I mentioned an article written by Masterclass. It talked about finding inspiration in your reading of various books. This is so important, like what John mentioned. Try to find similarities and inspirations in both the books you read and the players you lead. When you find connections, you can enhance the story for players with interesting choices they have to make, as well as trying in the player's character backstory, as well as what they make players have to deal with. Things that weren't sure they would ever have to do. I like to start by looking at story structure and character progression in fantasy stories. Looking at two examples of fantasy book series, it can give you good ways of tying in backstories or even helping move characters through the world in a thoughtful and meaningful way. Let's take a look at Dungeon Crawler Carl again. It does a decent job helping guide the main character through the world, using his feelings and opinions are big motivators on how it gets done. He also has relationship and family drama, which plays heavily into his character development, his progress through the world dungeon. With this area of being a dungeon master, it can be hard to grab inspiration from books since every character and every world is a little bit different, but it can be done. The memories of Carl's mother and father haunt him like a ghost, one melancholic and the other maleficent. The story does a great job of showing how these memories affect him and how they change his actions and situations posed to him. In the 6th book of the series, Carl has to deal with the memory of his father in a very unusual way. The people who control the dungeon set up a confrontation between Carl and his late father inside of an immersive memory, where he's forced to watch him die, murdered by his new wife. In the same book, Carl was forced to dredge up the memories of his childhood and tell the story of how his mom tried to kill his father, and how he later found her body hanging down in the basement. For your players, moments like these can make compelling gameplay and incredible chances for roleplay and growth of the player, as well as the character that they play. Motivating your players like this can be fun and engaging. In Book 3 of Dungeon Crawler Carl, an impossible situation was posed to him. The 3rd book had 2 giant groups of crawlers, which are other people in the dungeon. They are stranded and trapped, surrounded by thousands of monsters and nowhere to go. Does he save one group or the other? He relived moments of feeling hopeless, like when he found his mom, or when he confronted his dad in defiance, and decided that somehow, some way, while he could still fight and breathe, he would save everyone. Even when a binary choice is given to your players, expect them to find some way out of it. Players will try their hardest to have their cake and eat it too. In the 6th book of the series, another impossible situation was forming around Carl and his friends. Tens of thousands of crawlers seemed like they would die, and there was nothing anyone could do. Throughout the growing chaos of the situation, there were many small hints dropped on a secret way out of the problem. This is something you as a dungeon master can try to do as well. Set up a giant problem with seemingly no way out of it. Make it seem hopeless. Build up the tension. But offer them small clues to the solution. Either way, it's a great story. Either the players somehow manage to figure out all the clues, or the bad thing happens. Or they may even come up with something so crazy that they get out of it in their own way. Like I've said, guiding players comes in a few different forms. You can help the characters grow and change, or give the power to the characters to grow and change the world. The best way to do it, in my opinion, is a bit of both. Remember that you and your players are telling a story together, and unexpected things will happen. Do your best to roll with the punches thrown at you, make something great together. Being a dungeon master is hard work, making worlds, making NPCs, and helping players, but it doesn't always have to be. The best thing a new or experienced dungeon master can do is read. Read as much fantasy as you can. As you've listened, I've hoped that things have become easier for you to understand, figure out ways to make the world of being a dungeon master start to work for you. World building is very meticulous and extensive, but taking inspiration from some of your favorite books can make it fun. Non player characters can be a dime a dozen, but now you can see just how much you can do with them, or as little as you want. Guiding players in a collaborative experience with group storytelling. Work together, make it compelling and engaging, give them hard choices, and make them feel real. The most important thing to keep in mind when reading is have fun and enjoy yourself. Thank you for listening.